Thanks for coming on, Keith. So,
Thanks for having me.
In many ways, my career trajectory started with you, which is that the first real way that I got to know people at the Ayn Rand Institute, although I think there was kind of mutual knowing of each other before then, was taking your introductory writing class in the Objectivist Academic Center, which eventually led to me working there. So thanks for that. But I really wanted to talk about just communication in general, because I certainly learned a ton from you. I know a lot of people who have benefited from your classes. And so as somebody who's deeply interested in the art of writing, I love getting my writing teachers on here. And but I wanted to start with, like, how did your journey begin? So how did you discover Ayn Rand? And then how did you end up going from somebody who has a PhD in physics to a writing instructor at a philosophy organization?
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, I'm sort of a prototypical product of ARI's educational funnel. We like to talk about that. You know, we have a whole set of programs that are aimed at making young people aware of Ayn Rand's ideas and then helping them along their journey and exploring those ideas. So I was introduced to Ayn Rand at age 15. You know, my parents recommended that I read the novels. And then I saw an ad for the Fountainhead essay contest posted in front of my guidance counselor's office in my high school. So it's like, so I participated in the Fountainhead essay contest. I only realized later this was in the second year that they were running the contest. So this was 1987.
Good
I didn't win it. Yeah, I mean, the fact that, you know, I'm off in Canada, you know, but they sent flyers out everywhere, and teachers were willing to advertise scholarship essay contests. I mean, it was a great idea this was one of, you know, ARI was only founded in 1985. So this is one of the earliest programs. I know Harry Binswanger was instrumental in coming up with the idea for doing this. But so that early, you know, I was already aware of ARI and participated in the essay contest. I went to some of the summer conferences and got super excited about you know, the objectivist movement. I went back to my college and I restarted the campus club there. So I, you know, brought in speakers and hosted meetings. And, you know, this was at the time when, if you wanted to listen to the Leonard Peikoff courses, you had to have a tape deck and you had to have a whole group of people and rent them from the organization. So I would, you know, we would hang out at the University of British Columbia campus on a Saturday night, sitting around a tape deck, listening to Leonard Peikoff. And it was like an amazing, you know, people who went through that, you know, it looks kind of weird to think about it today, but it was an amazing experience to do that.
We definitely have the best college Saturday night stories.
Well, we always went for Greek food afterwards. So we'd, you know, sit eating this amazing Greek food and talking about Aristotle and things like that. So it was great. So I was always involved with ARI, participating in their programs, you know, attending conferences, that kind of thing. At the same time, I was studying physics because I was really interested in it. You know, I've always been strong in math and science. And in some ways, I went into physics partly because of my interest in objectivism. I wanted to study general relativity because there's all these sort of interesting philosophical questions that come up about the nature of space and time. And so, you know, it wasn't totally unrelated. I wanted to study general relativity for that reason. And so I went off to graduate school and I, you know, got my PhD in theoretical astrophysics, studying black holes and neutron stars and that sort of thing. All the while I was taking courses from ARI in the Objectivist Graduate Center, you know, and participating in the educational programs. And in particular, the writing course had a really big impact on me.
Who was teaching it in those days?
Yeah, so this was when Rob Trzynski was teaching the writing course, and he designed, you know, a really high quality course with lots of interesting homework assignments and examples. I wouldn't say I was always more of a math science guy. I wouldn't say I was ever sort of a natural writer. Like, you've talked about how you just would always write, you know, and you had to learn how to write well, but you know, the desire to write and the motivation to write is always there. That's not necessarily true of me. It was always, it's always like work to really sit down and do it, but very satisfying when it goes well.
Do you think that helps you as a teacher, given like I know some teachers really benefit from the fact that they struggled with something, and so they're very conscious of the principles that allowed them to eventually succeed in it?
Yeah, I mean, what I found I was good at in the writing class when I was a student in it was I found that I had a knack for analyzing writing and giving feedback. I think that's, I think my strength really is more as a writing teacher and an editor. I don't have a huge body of work. I mean, I have a few really substantial articles, and I'm proud of the things that I've written. But if you compare my output to other people, I mean, certainly yourself or other people at ARI, it's not a huge body of work, but I, part of the reason for that is I wear a lot of hats at ARI and I manage a lot of programs and that kind of thing. But I also spend a lot of time, teaching and editing. And I think, that's probably where my biggest impact is. So, so then just to, the story of my life, just to get to the end of that, I was doing postdoctoral research in physics while taking all these courses from ARI, getting really inspired and excited about the writing class and about, part of what I found exciting about analyzing people's writing is the logic. There's a lot of logical structure and a lot of logical thinking that goes into that. And I think that appealed to my, the logic side of me. And so, I reached a certain point where I had to decide, was I going to definitely pursue a career as a physicist, teaching, professor, doing research and teaching. And I had already, by that time, I'd already kind of realized it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And so ultimately I decided to leave the field. And I had this whole other parallel track of things that I've been involved in. So I decided to pursue that. The first thing I did was I had a part-time job as assistant editor for the Intellectual Activist. I don't know if you knew that.
Oh, really? No, yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So this was
editor at that point.
Yeah. So this was Rob Trzynski. So the Intellectual Activist is a newsletter that was started by Peter Schwartz in the late 70s. Ayn Rand had a favorable view of his writings, that she saw. I mean, it was right towards the end of her life. And by the time I joined, it was being run by Rob Trzynski, and I had a part-time job, so I got a fair bit of writing and editing experience. I just did it for 1 year, but that was my first work in objectivism, I guess you could call it that. And then eventually I joined ARI, and I was brought in specifically to be a teaching assistant for the writing course and also to write and edit op-eds. So that was what, that was how I came to ARI and what I was brought on to do.
And so what year was it that you finally took over the writing course for the OAC?
Yeah, I think I was a TA for my first year, and then I started teaching it. So it was like 2004 or something like that.
And so I think for most teachers I've talked to, I interviewed my screenwriting teacher a few weeks back, and he sort of had a similar trajectory of like, he, was doing stuff and then found himself teaching, screenwriting, which is something he never expected to do. And so I asked him, well, did you start out with what I got, decades after you began doing this? And he said, no, basically it started with me just doing what I had learned from my teachers and then evolved into something else. Is that sort of where you started from? That's
exactly right. And, almost everything I've learned about writing and editing and teaching writing comes from on-the-job experience. In a lot of ways, I really didn't know what I was doing at first. I had the template for the course by kind of taking that over. And my continuing education in all of this came from Yaron Brook and Onkar Gate. I mean, what it's like to write and edit under their guidance. And, so that was really, I think that's where I learned the most, between that plus just getting a lot of practice and experience teaching the writing class, looking at student papers and giving them feedback and and then at the time there were a bunch of us writing op-eds and editing each other, and you eventually came and were a part of that as well. And that was a really fun time of just all working together and developing and honing our skills. So
that's
I had the opportunity to take some writing seminars with Peter Schwartz as well, and that was really helpful. He was kind of the original OGC writing teacher. So.
Yeah. Something I haven't talked, I think, a lot about is the value to you as a writer from editing others, because I had done a little of it informally over the years, but then the first time I really had to sit down and do it is when you handed me a stack of assignments for your OAC class and said, "Hey, can you do a first pass editing at these?" Huh. And now that was kind of like a gem, right? Because I got the practice of editing, and then I got feedback on my editing, which is it's so much easier to spot errors that you're likely to commit on other people's work than it is your own errors. And I also find it one of the most enjoyable parts of writing, because you get to spot problems, come up with ideas that might fix them, but not have to actually implement it.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, like, for people who want to get better at writing, one thing is look for opportunities to give other people feedback, because it is hugely valuable.
I think people often have the view that editing, well, I don't ever plan to be an editor. I just want to be a writer. So why do I need to learn how to edit? But, Leonard Peikoff has this great line in his objective communication course where he says that you have to have the perspective on your own writing. You have to be able to read it as though it was written by someone you vaguely dislike. And I just love the intellectual precision of that, because it's not like you rabidly dislike them, because then you'll have too critical an eye. It's like you vaguely dislike them. I mean, you're just casting a suspicious eye on their work, which is the mindset that you want to have. And, what I tell my students is, the best way to develop that skill is to edit the work of other people. Not, hopefully you don't vaguely dislike your classmates, but you develop the skill of trying to put yourself in the mindset of somebody who's not the writer of this piece, who's an outside person looking at it. The best way to do that is by literally being an outside person and editing other people's things. And most of, the funny thing about the writing course that I teach is that's what most of it consists of. I mean, people think, I'm going to take the course, I'm going to write things, I'm going to get feedback on my stuff. But most of the time, if there's 20 students in the class, you write one paper and then we give you feedback on that. The other 19 papers is you're hearing feedback about other people's work. And that can be sometimes even more valuable than the feedback on your own work, I think, for the reasons that you just described. Yeah.
Particularly if you sit down first and come up with what your own feedback would be.
Right.
Because there's a real temptation when you listen to things. I learned this lesson actually taking Onkar's Objectivism Through Induction class, where we listened to Leonard's course, Objectivism Through Induction. Yeah. We did the assignments, and then we would hear Leonard's, analysis and see exactly why we were completely wrong. And one of the things that I got from that was, it would have been very easy just to listen to Leonard's answers and not along go, oh yeah, that's exactly how you would get justice from reality. Versus if you first start out by saying, well, here's how I would do it. Then you see the gap and you see exactly, this is where my mind went. This is where his mind went. And there's just so much more learning. And I think it's the same thing if you edit somebody's writing and then hear somebody else analyze it, you get a lot more out of it than if you just read their piece and had somebody tell you what was good and bad about it.
Yeah.
So when people come into the OAC, I know that there are all different levels in terms of their strengths and weaknesses as thinkers and as communicators. What are some of the things that you find are the most common areas where people really have, let's call it points where they can improve?
Well, let me actually, before we talk about that, let me say a few things about the course, because I think it's helpful just to kind of set the context. So I've been teaching some version of this course, the OAC writing course, for basically almost 20 years now. And I've learned a lot about writing and editing and how to teach this over that time. So I think, I think the first 10 years, I mean, you say you got a lot out of the course, which I'm glad to hear. I think the first 10 years, I think the course was good. Like, it was a really solid, decent grounding, and I think the students got a lot out of it. But I don't think it was sort of over the top good. But I think the version of the course that I've been teaching since roughly 2017, I've really sort of honed it over the years and designed it to kind of optimize for the things that I think people need to get out of the course. I think it's important also to understand that this is really an introduction to writing. I think for a lot of the students, this is probably the first time they've ever had like real, serious, substantial feedback on their writing. Most of the time, if you show somebody something you've written, it's very superficial. They'll point out some typos and, oh, you need to fix this word here or punctuation. They don't themselves know how to look at a piece of writing and have a big picture overview of, is there an argument here? Is there a theme? Is there even a subject? So I think for students who take the class, I think there are sort of two major values that they get out of it. One is a really realistic view of just what is actually required to write well and how much effort it takes. Now, they don't always experience it as a value, because it can be really discouraging, right? I mean, we've all written all our lives in one form or another. We think we kind of have the basic mechanics down, and then suddenly you're in a world where you're trying to do it at a more professional level, and there's a lot that goes into that you never even knew went into that. And so it can be very discouraging to experience that, but at the same time, I think it's a really high value for people to experience that and to realize, no, this is a professional skill. It takes a lot of work to develop it. And then the second value is there is a way to develop it. There is a method, there is a process, there are things that you can do. So I think one of the biggest values they get is a conceptual framework, for thinking about writing and what goes into writing, and they get the writing process. The fact that there's a method to writing and a process that you go to in working on an article. You don't just sit down with a blank page and start churning stuff out. There's a lot of thinking and preparation before you go into that. So I think, the question was, what are some of the things that people, you're asking what are the challenges that they run into. So I'll get to that in a minute. I think that it's important context to see that this is what their experience is coming into the course. They don't have the concepts. They don't know any principles. They don't, know what the process is. And they don't have a realistic sense of just how hard it is and how much work it takes to write well. And so they get all of this for the first time as, being churned through this class, I think. Now, so in terms of the biggest things that they need to learn, I'd say probably number one is the issue of having a strong sense of your audience's context. So the biggest challenge I think that people run into, and the most work that they have to do, is in trying to figure out where their audience is with respect to the subject that they want to write about. I think too many people come into the process of writing with the idea that, I have all these great ideas, I have all these things I want to say, and writing is about saying them. I just want to tell people what I think. And they forget that writing is a form of communication. And if what you're saying isn't presented in a way that your reader can receive it and take it in and absorb it and understand it, they're not going to be persuaded of what you're saying.
I think, you mentioned comments I made, like I had a kind of strong baseline level of writing in a sense, but when it came to philosophy, my whole experience for the most part, until I started working with you and then eventually ARI, was writing for people who were at least familiar with Ayn Rand. And there's just such an assumed context there that that when you strip that away and say, all right, you're talking to the world, 99.9%, which have not read Atlas Shrugged, the amount of awareness you have to have about the audience context, what you can and can't take for granted, what you can build on positively, where there are areas where they know, where they have knowledge you can count on and values you can count on. That really was a struggle, but then it was also exciting and empowering, because it's all right, now I can actually write stuff that will be valued by people who are not kind of pre-sold on my ideas. So that to me was the hardest part, was taking a step back and getting the audience's context and learning how to connect with it. Or at least that was one of the major things that really took me, I would say, 3 years before I felt at all really comfortable with it. Obviously I was getting better during those 3 years, but it was a long stretch.
And I think there are some misconceptions that people can have about the idea of the audience context, and the need to take that into account. Because sometimes people will say, "Well, why do you need to do that? Why don't you if you have something to say, why don't you just get up there and say it and be provocative?" Sometimes people have the view that the way you motivate an audience is by standing up and saying something so outrageous that they immediately say, well, how can you say such a thing? Well, let me tell you. But I think I sometimes think about it with an analogy to business, because there's the idea, the customer is always right, or that the way to succeed in business is always give the customer what he wants, right? And like Steve Jobs famously hated that view, right? He's like, screw the customer. They don't even know what they want, right? I'm going to teach them what's good. And I think that people can view this as a kind of false alternative. It's like the customer drives everything, or the customer be damned. But the real view, and even if you look at Apple and Steve Jobs, I mean, yes, his view is, I'm going to teach them what to want. But, notice how radically focused he is on the user experience and on the needs of the user. Like when you hold, I'm pulling a Yaron Brook here. I'm going to hold up my iPhone and throw it around here. The amount of thought and effort that goes into what is the experience that someone will have when they use this device, from the touch screen, how does it feel in your hand? I mean, it's a radical, fanatical focus on the needs of the user.
My favorite example with Jobs is, I think it was like the design of the icon for the trash can on like a Mac, or it was the cursor, and he was like nitpicking over it. And finally, I think one of the designers is pushing back, and he says, the customer's going to have to stare at that every day that they're using this, and if it's not perfect, that makes it a nightmare. And it's in that sense that he's deeply concerned with the customer, while like not just whatever you guys want, tell me what you want, let me just serve it out. Yeah, exactly.
So I think the equivalent in writing is to be focused on the audience's context doesn't mean that you're like conceding or pandering to their viewpoints, right? But it also doesn't mean that you just ignore it altogether and just drop bombshells that they have no ability to process. So the right idea is you want to be super clear about your viewpoint and what it is that you want to communicate to them. And then, you have to be fanatically focused on what do they need to be able to see? What do they need to be able to see it for themselves, right? And it takes so much effort to think about what they need, given their context of knowledge, given their values, given the viewpoints they're exposed to in the culture. What do they need to be able to grasp your point, which they don't come into the article knowing? And I think that's really the hardest thing that people struggle with. And because I think that's kind of the challenge of communication. So.
Yeah. And it's often made more difficult, I think, by this isn't universally true, but most of us are still like at a relatively early stage of learning the philosophy we're trying to communicate. And so there can be errors of like, I just remember one time I turned in something to Onkar, not for the OAC, but for actual, like, I want to release this to the world under ARI's banner. And we're all gathered around a table and he asks for everybody's opinion. And people had different opinions, like, oh, I think the structure's off here. And he goes, yeah, I think the major thing is this isn't true. and it was, all right, you have to, you want to get to the truth before you can worry about how to communicate it. But yeah, it's communicating the truth to an audience that has presumably a very different context is kind of like the foundational challenge that I think most of us face.
I would say another issue, or maybe you could put it as another concept that I think people aren't aware of and maybe doesn't get discussed enough in talking about writing, is the issue of contrast. The idea that, and this is intimately related to the issue of the audience's context, but it's you have a certain view that you want to put across, but as opposed to what? What is the viewpoint that your audience is coming in with from which you're going to differentiate the thing that you're talking about? And this is really, it's not something that you hear talked about in discussions of writing in the objectives community. I think there's a part of Leonard Peikoff's objective communication course where he says some intriguing things about it, and that I think was what prompted me to think about it more. But it comes down to a fundamental issue in epistemology. I mean, the two basic processes of consciousness are integration and differentiation, and so just the very process of concept formation is integrating two or more similars as against something that's different. And so the idea of having they talk about a foil in literature, right? Having a viewpoint that you're disagreeing with. What are you not saying? That is what helps what you are saying really stand out and be clear. I think I've come to the view that it's really essential for clarity. I think you can take any good piece of writing. Sometimes it's not super obvious. There can be subtleties about it, but I think if you take any good piece of writing, you can always find an element of contrast. Maybe they don't bring it out explicitly or state it explicitly, but there's always an element of contrast that's there. Where nonfiction writing, where the theme of the author's point of view is being differentiated from something else.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned this term foil coming from fiction, but I think that's a really helpful place to see it, right? Like the Fountainhead works because it's not just Rourke; it's Rourke as against Keating, as against Toohey, as against Winan, and it's by seeing those variations that we go, oh, she means this, not this other thing that is diametrically opposed, and not this other thing it might be confused with, right? So it's like independence versus a complete dependent like Keating. But what about somebody like Winan who seems to be after something for himself, which is power? And then we get, oh no, independence means independence from people in this kind of deeper sense. And I think seeing it there and then realizing, all right, I can't make my positive view clear if it's not differentiated from something. And I think that is often lack of clarity about that. It makes it hard really to even figure out, how do I execute my theme? Like I want to say something positive, but if I don't know what the view is that I'm distinguishing mine from, well, there's a million things I could say about it.
Yeah, and the other thing that it accomplishes is motivation, because if you start your article basically by acknowledging to the reader that I understand what you think about this issue, I know where you're coming from. I'm going to talk about X, and I know that when you look at X, you think ABC about it. So I get that, right? And you can, and often you can articulate it better than they can. Here's what you think about this issue. And then you say, here are some observations or facts that suggest that this way of thinking about it might not be right. And I'm going to show you a different way of thinking about it. I mean, that's sort of the pattern, I think, of nonfiction writing. At a certain level of abstraction, I think you can look at it in that way. There's almost a template to it, but that's really motivating for the reader, because they read what you're saying from the point of view of they have the experience of you saying to them, I really understand your context. I really see where you're coming from. And they if they experience that, they as they go through the article, they really have a sense that you're like reading their mind, and the next question that comes up or the next thought that occurs to them, that's what you bring up next. And like, wow, this guy really knows where I'm coming from. And that's how you kind of you invite them to continue on the journey through your argument.
Yeah, and it's really important that you do it, because when people are kind of processing an argument. So let's say, you have a conclusion that says, I think we should use more fossil fuels, which is a conclusion I spent several years helping to argue for.
Yeah.
The immediate thing is that they have sort of knee-jerk objections. And if they don't have the sense that you're aware of those and going to address them, then they're not going to process anything else that you say. Right. And you might not be able to deal with it, let's say, until 5 paragraphs or 5 pages in. But you at least have to acknowledge, I say that knowing full well that, there's this view that fossil fuels are destroying the climate and making our climate unlivable. And that at least gives them permission to go, okay, he's going to come back to this and address it. Whereas if you come across as unaware of an objection, even if in your own mind you're perfectly aware of it, but if you don't let the reader know, yes, I understand where you're coming from in this and why you might not be instantly convinced of the conclusion or might disagree with the conclusion, you can't get anywhere else.
Yeah. If they think that you are oblivious to their concerns or their objections, then you're lost. So.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, I think, a lot of it's usually not in a policy context where I think people make that error grossly, but often in more philosophical, like ethical context. Like if you're arguing for selfishness, and I mean, it depends on exactly the context, right? Which objections are most glaring to them. But, I've had the experience where if you don't put in the table that, I'm perfectly aware that there's many awful things that you associate with selfishness, but I don't think that they're selfish. If you don't get that on the table, it's really the experience of the person is you're clueless and crazy, not, I'm intrigued because that's so controversial.
Right. And that's why, I mean, the introduction of the virtue of selfishness is, why would I use a word like this? This seems crazy. And then she explains, so. Yeah.
So in terms of actually teaching, well, here, this is kind of a narrower question, but it's one that I've been writing about and thinking a lot about recently. I have found that the one area in writing where I don't really know what help to offer people is just if they can't really put together a clear sentence. If there's just kind of, and I don't mean like they're completely ungrammatical and don't know English, but there's a kind of, just ability to put together sentences that generally follow one from the next, that you can then help somebody understand concepts like structure and clarity and contrast. But if they can't do that, I don't really know what to tell them except like go read a lot and like read your writing aloud or things like that. Do you have any thoughts on kind of just base level writing ability that's kind of even what you teach, pre-introduction?
Yeah. I mean, the thought that comes to mind when you say that is they should study grammar. I mean, one of the travesties of the modern education system is the devaluing of education in grammar and just, the art of diagramming sentences. I mean, it's the kind of thing that one should get in elementary school, and there are only very few schools that actually do this. But I think that's where you can learn the nuts and bolts of how to put words together to form coherent, to express your thoughts coherently. And, there are lots of good resources on, and I think part of what you get when you study grammar is you conceptualize these things. So you understand, if you understand the difference between the subject and the predicate and the noun and the verb and the adjective, I mean, you can articulate more and explain more clearly just why something isn't even coherent, if you can put it in those terms. So that's what I would suggest. I haven't really encountered that. I mean, as you say, this is sort of pre coming into my course, so I haven't really encountered that too much, except, we have a lot of students from around the world, and sometimes people's command of English isn't great. And so often, the just phrasing and word choice, and there's awkward constructions and things like that. I usually don't dwell on those, but I do suggest to people that if they want to write in English and they want to write at a high level, they should take the time to study grammar. I mean, Leonard Peikoff has this excellent course on the principles of grammar, which
now
I think
a book.
It's coming. Yeah, it's out. It's out now. It's out as a book. Yeah. So there's no excuse. So.
No, and it's one of the few courses of his that I think work better as a book, because it's easier to retain all the new concepts you're being introduced to. Whereas in the original course, like I remember trying to drive in my car and listen to it, and he defines, and here's a noun, here's a gerund, and I'm like, all right, I need to sit down and write this all out.
When I took that course, I was doing it by myself in my living room, and I literally stopped the tape every sentence and made notes, because you just, same thing. Little known fact, that book, Donna Montreza and Mike Berliner did a ton of editing, because, if you're taking a course on grammar and you're turning it into a book, the copy editing had better be damn near perfect, right? So they put a lot of effort and work into that. But there was one summer where my daughter, was looking for something to do in the summer, and she had a little internship at ARI, and she spent a bit of time, she'd studied enough grammar from her Montessori education that she spent a little bit of time doing some copy editing of that book. So
that's amazing, especially because she's still frozen in my mind at the age she was 4 years ago when I left California, which it's always weird with your friends' kids.
Yeah.
One thing I definitely wanted to talk to you, and we've kind of touched on some elements of it already, but the area where I always was most impressed by you as an editor was in structure, which is in how do you break down the argument that's being made in a piece, where it's going wrong. And so most people, I think, haven't even heard the term in a writing context of structure, and certainly don't have a lot of principles of structure. So I wonder if you can just say a little bit about how you think about what is structure, why it's so important, and what makes it tricky.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way they would have heard it is in the context of the need to have an outline, which is the plan for the points that you're going to make in the order that you're going to make them. And the idea, the principle is that there needs to be a logic to it. It's not just a series of points that are unrelated to each other. There are logical relations between the points that you're making, and they need to be ordered in such a way that they need to be structured in such a way that the reader can take them in. I think again, and this is why I keep coming back to the issue of the audience context is paramount, because I think this is also what drives the issue of structure as well. What you're doing in a piece of nonfiction writing is you're trying to persuade your reader to consider a new idea or a perspective on an issue, right? Now, in order to do that, what you're doing is you're pointing them to certain facts in reality, examples or concretes, and you're drawing out implications of those facts. You're making an abstract argument. And there's this process of shuttling back and forth between abstractions and conclusions, abstractions and concretes, right? So the whole issue of logical structure comes down to, given the reader's context, in what order do they need to have the facts and arguments presented to them so that they can follow what you're saying and go? I mean, really, you're taking, in a piece of writing, you're taking the reader on a journey. You're saying your starting point is that you think ABC about this topic, and I want to show you a whole different perspective on it. So knowing that your starting point is that you think ABC, what facts do I need to present to you, and what abstract points and arguments do I need to make in order to move you from the one to the other? So I think really it's
but see, that sounds easy. Like as you explain it there, right? Like, how much trouble can that be?
Yeah. So the thing is, I think there's no royal road to structure except through, again, the issue of, I think what it comes down to is the issue of how do you get a good sense of the audience's context and the audience's needs. I mean, so it comes back to the previous challenge. And I think that it's a matter of, well, I mean, one thing that I think is helpful, if you want to write about a particular topic, read about that topic in, the top publications, whether you agree with them or not. Just seeing how, there are a lot of good writers out there in the culture, and you can learn a lot from them, even if you can disagree fundamentally with everything that comes out of their mouth. You can learn a lot from them from the point of view of how they address their audience. What do they take for granted? What do they not take for granted? What do they assume about the audience's knowledge and about the audience's values on this topic? So if you're new if you're coming to a topic for the first time, or if you're just new to writing and you pick a certain topic to specialize in, you can learn a lot by reading high quality writing from this point of view and with this in mind. And then, ultimately, I think it's a matter of a lot of experience and practice. Trying to write, trying to take the context into account, and then getting feedback from a good editor on who can help you identify why this isn't working or that isn't working.
I'll name one kind of problem that I think comes up here. I've certainly suffered from this, and I see it a lot in other people, which is, so you have something that's personally motivating to you that makes you want to write about a topic. And you've learned enough to go, well, I can't just kind of spill my guts and say whatever I want to say. I want to be objective. So you kind of come up with a theme that you think works, and you have to play around with it, and it doesn't quite work. And you kind of settle on something, but then you constantly, I want to squeeze in this thing that I really want to say, or a point that I'm really in love with, or in other words, that when we just describe the writing process in a very straight way, in practice, it's very messy, and in part because you're often going back and forth between your motivation and between your kind of abstract knowledge of how writing ought to be done. And it's work to kind of fuse those two so that you're no longer actually tempted to indulge yourself, but you're not kind of drearily, doodly writing a piece you don't want to write.
Yeah. I had the experience as an editor. It was an interesting realization for me. I was editing a piece at ARI, and when I thought about the point that was being made, it was one of these points where it's sort of, you have to have a lot of context. You already kind of have to have a certain perspective that comes from objectivism, even to get the question that the author wants to raise. And then the point that they want to make, you really, it's not something. When I thought about it, and I thought, okay, if you just say, I'm going to talk about this subject to a general audience that ARI is trying to reach, this question isn't even a live question for them. It's not even on the table. And before you could even get close to talking about this, here's what they really need to here's what they would really need to be told and to be persuaded of. And so, when I talk about having a fanatical focus on the reader's context, sometimes that literally means, you can't even try to get this theme across there. You have to change your theme because
or your audience.
Well, yeah, but maybe. I mean, but then I think I think there are good reasons to write for a more delimited audience, an objectivist audience, but I think it's going to be more, your writing is going to be more impactful the more you can reach the outside world and reach people who don't have this context. And I think having the discipline, I mean, like you just said, having the discipline to be able to say, no, okay, I'm going to change my theme because the audience that I'm trying to reach, they need to hear this point, not the point that I'm excited about or that I find interesting at an abstract level. And if I were sitting down in the bar with my friends, I would make this point, it's,
yeah. I mean, my view is that just know what you're doing and don't work at cross purposes. And that's the, like if you're going to indulge yourself, fine, but know that I'm kind of writing this for the 3 people who are interested. But I think as an actual practice, particularly if your goal is to get better at communicating to a wider audience who is very foreign to your context, I agree is indispensable. If all you ever do is indulge yourself, you definitely will not reach kind of the ability to even influence your narrow audience very well, because
I think people overestimate what a quote objectivist audience does or doesn't know. I mean, if you look at Ayn Rand's Ford Hall Forum talks, which were aimed at her fan, it's her fan base who's coming to the Ford Hall Forum to hear her speak. Or if you look at Leonard Peikoff's Ford Hall Forum talks, objectivists learn an enormous amount from them, and they are not aimed at objectivists at all.
Yeah, that's a really important point. One thing I wanted to come to is, so we've said, and you've said, like, your strength was sort of like analyzing structure and things like that. But you're also good at being kind of clever and having kind of these memorable tidbits in the pieces that you have written. So I mean, what my favorite that comes to me, I'm sure I'm forgetting some of your titles, which you were infamous for, but is you wrote a piece for the second edition of Why Businessmen Need Philosophy on energy and energy deprivation by the environmentalist movement, where you draw in this like memorable analogy from Atlas Shrugged, where these people discover Galt discovers a form of energy that's basically costless, no pollution, super clean and everything. And you kind of raise this question of, if this really happened, how would environmentalists react? And then we get, well, how they did react to something very close to that, which was the idea that we had discovered nuclear fusion, and how they ended up rejecting it, and how this helped shed light in their motives. Yeah. So how do you think about the role of not just having a logical argument, but being able to make it memorable, engaging? Do you see that as like a learnable skill set? And then if so, how does one learn it? Taking for granted that this is not the most fundamental writing skill, but I think it is important. If you want to get published, you can't just be clear. I think you actually have to be like interesting and memorable.
Yeah. I think so there's also the issue of humor. I think this has to come from your personality. If you and so part of the value of, so one of the things that we cover in the course is the writing process, and the idea that there are different stages of writing, and that sort of, psychologically, you have to know what you're doing at any given stage. If you're out, if you're just thinking on paper, that's not the same thing as I'm actually writing for the purpose of communication. You're just getting thoughts down on paper that are not meant for other people to see. And that's a useful first step at getting your stuff, just getting a handle on what is it that you're even wanting to talk about, and then, organizing your thoughts into an argument and creating an outline, and then writing the draft, and then when you're in the editing stage, it's a very different, you're trying to get distance from your writing, and you're putting your editing hat on, you're looking at it very critically. It's a very different mindset. And I think one of the things that's really freeing about that is that the writing part of that. So you've done your planning, you have an idea of what you're going to say. And this is something, this goes back to Ayn Rand she gave a course on writing that I think a lot of objectivist writing instruction ultimately derives from this course that she gave, and it was turned into this book, The Art of Nonfiction, edited by Robert Mayhew. One of the things that she talks about there is that the writing part is really just letting your subconscious free to just flow. And so I think a lot of the ideas for humor and like engaging grabby intros and things like the things that make writing sing and be more engaging and colorful, a lot of that comes from just letting the reins go in thinking like I'm editing or I'm planning, and just letting it come out. I mean, the times when I've and that's also super fun. One of my favorite experiences writing, it was preparing a talk that was eventually turned into an article. And it was an article on Darwin, sort of Darwin's biography. And there was this period in Darwin's life when he spent like years and years and years studying barnacles. And I'd read there were these kind of funny quotes about this, like things that he said about how much he hated barnacles and all this stuff. And it was just, and when I got to that stage of the writing, it's just, you've got it all organized and you can just let it flow. And I'm sitting here laughing out loud as I'm typing this stuff out, because it's just, so I think it comes from your personality, and it comes from having it as a value that you don't just want to say something that's clear, but you want to engage. You want to grab the reader's attention and find a way to engage them and interest them and motivate them. And the Atlas Shrugged motor thing, basically you talked about. So there are these quotes, these sort of famous quotes from Paul Ehrlich and Amory Lovins, like, where they literally say, if we had an unlimited clean source of energy, that would be a disaster, right? And so, just knowing that I wanted to use those quotes and knowing that I wanted to concretize that in some way, it just kind of, it writes itself, because you have this fictional presentation, this science fiction example of something that is exactly what they, are talking about. So, yeah.
I agree with everything you've said there. One thing that I warn people about, because this happened to me and I've seen it happen to others, is if they do have just an inner joy of writing, they can often go through a period where they start to I need to be more rigorous and more professional in the writing, go through a period where they'll see some of that magic disappear. Like they won't be coming up with these, really clever or hilarious, lines, and the eloquence might go down a notch. And one thing I warn them is, well, it's because your focus is shifted and you're trying to learn this new skill set that's going to make you a better writer. But what will eventually happen is you'll be able to fuse those two things together where, all right, once I've really started to build a foundation of having a system for writing objectively and persuasively, to an audience, that will come back. So don't fear that happening, but just know that can happen. You're not losing the magic, but it's like anything else. When you're learning a new skill, sometimes the new thing you're focusing on will cause you not to be able to focus on other elements. Like in baseball, if you're tweaking your swing, even if you're, a professional level hitter, you could go through a slump as you're trying to make this adjustment that ultimately get you to a higher level.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like when Tiger Woods changed his golf swing.
Right.
You know, there's that story of like, he was this sort of natural, and then he realized there was some things that were off in it. And if he really wanted to get to the next level, he needed to go back and make fundamental adjustments to the basic swing. And so he took a hit in the way you're describing, and then of course came back. So yeah.
So I usually don't do this, but I'm such a fan of the OAC, and I think it's so important for anybody who really is seriously interested in becoming an objectivist intellectual, or who just really wants to learn the philosophy and how to communicate it well. So I hope you'll indulge me and just like give a little bit more context for like who the program is for and what they need to do to take advantage of it.
Yeah, so we're actually in the process of really trying to expand the OAC, because we think it's one of the highest value programs that ARI has. And we've opened it up to quite a wide audience because we're admitting auditors. So, you know, I think anybody who's really, who's familiar with objectivism, but really wants to take their knowledge of objectivism to the next level, and, you know, to kind of reboot their whole method of thinking about things. It's like a crash course in how to think and how to communicate. So I think, I mean, just broadly, anybody can benefit as an auditor. For the graded students, we're looking for people who are potentially interested in an intellectual career, but we construe that quite broadly. So it could be, you know, so people, I mean, an intellectual career means somebody whose profession is devoted to writing, teaching, speaking about ideas. So, you know, professors in academia, public intellectuals, writers, speakers, podcasters, you know. So definitely anybody who's even contemplating that, they're thinking that maybe this is something they might want to do, you know, you should definitely consider the OAC, because part of what you'll get from the program is a sense of what are the activities that are involved in doing this kind of work, and is it a fit for me? Is it something I would see myself, you know, that I could love doing? But more broadly, there's a category of people who we think of as not just, you know, professional intellectuals, but intellectual professionals. So people who work in business or different areas of industry, but who their work requires them to bring a philosophical and intellectual perspective to bear. And I think one field where this is a real standout is the field of education. And there are a number of people who've had training in ARI's programs at one time or another, who've started schools, who've started companies related to education, and who use the training that they've got in philosophy and in communication and in thinking methodology in their work every day in the business of running schools and running a business related to education. And there are other fields, you know, that are like this as well. I think there's the phenomenon of people who are in a particular field, let's say medicine, but they want to comment on issues within their field. And you have famous examples of people like Atul Gawande, the famous surgeon who writes for The Atlantic. And, you know, he writes about his field. So he's both a practitioner, but also an intellectual within the field. So I think there are a lot of people whose career path would benefit from the kind of training that we offer. So if you think that you're in anything like these categories, I strongly encourage you to reach out to us. You can go to aynrand.org and you'll pretty easily find the Objectivist Academic Center section of the website, and you can contact us from there. We're going to be doing information sessions and that sort of thing. So thank you for making an exception to your normal rule, because I was hoping I would be able to give an endorsement for the OAC as part of the discussion today. So, well,
yeah, I mean, and I give it my endorsement. I would not be able to do what I'm doing without your class, without what I learned from OnCar, all of the whole program, which has gotten, I mean, I've been peeking into the latest ones that you guys have been doing the last year or two, and it's just improved even dramatically from when I took it, and it's just such a great value. One of the things, people ask me, it's like, well, hey, you keep talking about the value you get from editors. Like, what do I do? And I say, well, you have two options. You have more than this, but the two options I'll tell you is you can either pay me an ungodly amount of money and I'll give you feedback, or you can go through this program where, you get to learn from many of the people who taught me. So like, that's the, so yeah, I can't speak highly enough of the program. Thank you so much, Keith. I think this was really valuable and really fun. Anywhere else that people can go to follow you?
I mean, all of my stuff is in ARI's channel. So if you go to the Ayn Rand Institute YouTube channel, you can see some of my talks and podcasts. If you go to ARI's website, if you go to the Ayn Rand University app or the ARI campus website, you see some courses that I've given. If you go to AynRand.org or ARI.AynRand.org, you see things I've written. New Ideal is the journal of the Ayn Rand Institute, and you'll see some of my articles there. So that's basically where you'll find me. Or at Ocon. Come to Ocon and I'll talk to you there.
Yeah, I will be attending this year. So everybody
right.
Be sure to say hi, and hope to see you guys in Austin. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Keith.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Don. This was really fun.